One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" He answered, "Have you not read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, 'The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath.'"
So everybody take a deep breath. And just say, "Katie, we love you unconditionally." You're okay. Share with us. All right, you don't have to extend the same grace to me, but here we go. So, here we are. This is week 4, and sort of summer reflections on faith for the rest of us. And sort of the starting premise is, if you're at all like most of us, we get overworked and overwhelmed and burned out. And you've probably heard the quote somewhere along the way that the thinking that got us into this mess is not the same thinking that will get us out of it. And so the solution can't be just work harder. It's not just, well, we're really burned out, we should do something about it. Hence the tagline, don't just do something. Stand there. It's actually the opposite, the antithetical, seemingly nonsensical invitation to rest. Don't just do something. Stand there. And we need to learn to practice rest. Listen to what I'm saying. Not, we need to hustle to the point of exhaustion and then escape, which is sort of the typical kind of cultural deal. But instead, we need to learn to practice rest. So not escape. I can actually do this and hold the microphone. It looks super awkward. It feels awful, but it's all for the people. So we need to learn to practice rest. So last week we explored the foundation of the Judeo-Christian ethic, sort of the rhythm and the theology of rest, the Sabbath. In the creation story, it isn't that God stops working and then rests. Instead, rest is actually the crown jewel of creation. It's the sort of finale of creation, the cessation of work. And if you've ever tried, if you've ever struggled, or even if you've ever succeeded at resting well, you know that it actually takes immense effort. And a lot of times it takes immense creativity to achieve genuine rest. So the main idea we want to play with tonight is the rest of paradox. Paradox allows for the coexistence of seemingly contradictory realities. So in terms of rest and paradox, we might say it like this. Rest is not achieved in resolving tension, but in learning to find rest in it. So here's just one example. The completion of work and taking rest. We'll start with me, because I have sort of this wiring so that I feel deeply, and even if I convince myself intellectually, it doesn't matter, because I feel this way. This is like core of who I am, that if there is some sense of completion or accomplishment or achievement, that will allow me to finally finish a task. Then I can rest. As if rest is something on the other side of getting all the work done. For how many of you is that sort of something you're plagued by? You can rest once the work is done, or sort of that future gazing where you go, once that next project's complete, once we land that thing, once the contract's signed, once that kid graduates, then I can rest. It just doesn't ever happen. And this was me as a kid. Right? I would get assignments, I would do them immediately because I hated the feeling of having something hanging over my head, right? Which was really good until it was like 3 or 4 days before the big assignment was due, and then I had no friends because all my friends were all doing the assignment. I was like, I already did that last month. This is like the opposite of procrastination. You know what I'm talking about? Where like you've got to get it done because you're so afraid of it hanging over your head. Maybe you're going like, oh yeah, I know that. The word you're looking for, the opposite of procrastination, it's right on the tip of your tongue. Yeah. Just get it done as soon as you possibly can. So part of the paradox of rest is to learn to hold the seemingly contradictory realities that we can leave our work incomplete and also somehow genuinely rest from that labor. That's the paradox that I kind of want us to kick around tonight, that we can leave work incomplete and at the same time somehow genuinely rest from that labor. Guys, are you sitting down? Good, excellent. We can put down the to-do list without all of the boxes checked. I thought you were going to throw things at me. You can put down the to-do list without all of the boxes checked. And I know that that's heresy, and it's disgusting and dissonant injustice and a grotesque violation of your deepest instinct for harmony and integrity, but it's also okay. It's okay. If you haven't checked every box on the to-do list, and in fact, if the to-do list is twice as long when you're done with it as when you started, more and more boxes, it's okay. It's okay. For me, of course, the verdict is still out. I don't know if I believe that, but this is what the practice of Sabbath calls us to. It's what I'm trying to do and I'm failing at, but I'm learning to practice. And even practice, in and of itself, that's a paradox. That's the nature of practice. We're doing it because we can't do it. Did you ever think about that? Like, that's what we should have practices. Why? We should do it a lot. Why? Because we can't do it. That's what we're doing. The whole thing. This is paradox all the way through. It's not setting aside work when work is done, but regularly stepping away from work in a set rhythm, even when the work is not done. Rest is not setting aside work when it's done. It's learning to step away from the work, especially when it's not done, so that we can reclaim our humanity, apart from our achievement and our identity, apart from accomplishment. And this is, I know, this is lunacy. It's nonsense. But it's also really vital to being whole people. And then there's the means and the ends of our labor. So it's not even as easy as the paradox of literal work and literal rest. Like, are we or aren't we working? Are we or aren't we resting? That's sort of a surface level question about paradox, and we're going to get back to that in a minute. But first, at an even deeper level, we have to somehow come to peace with our own inner life. Our own inner life in relationship to work in the world. The work the world needs, and then our ability to contribute to that. I heard this from several people this past week, that it's not the work that burns them out, but it's the state of the world that burns them out. How many of you resonate with that? Maybe it's not even necessarily the work that burns you out, your job, your vocation, but it's just the way the world is, maybe especially for the last couple years. You feel overwhelmed, defeated, paralyzed, angry, scared. In some sense, what are we talking about? We're talking about the means and the ends of our labor. And again, I think holding that intention is a paradox. Maybe this is a part of what's happening, and as always, maybe not. I could be wrong. In the Hebrew Bible, there are what are called mitzvot, these good works, 613 commands in the Hebrew faith that name these good works that we ought to do. And then in the Christian scriptures, for we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, or mitzvot, which God prepared in advance for us to do. At first glance, we go, hold on, wait. So we're not created to go to heaven when we die. We're not created to believe the right religion or to go to church or get saved or to save our heathen neighbors. But we're created to do good. Just like super novel idea. Are you guys getting this? Is this on? We're created to do good. That's Christianity? To do good works? How many of you have been told something totally opposite of that? Christianity's not about good works. Okay, just wondering. Me too. So if it's about doing good works, if so, to what end? I'm glad you asked. The tikkun olam. This is, again, in the Hebrew faith, means the healing of the world, the repair of the world, or even the harmony of the world. And so mitzvot, good works, are the good works that bring about the improvement of the world. And not that the world is so broken or fallen or damned that it's beyond repair, but even though the assumption is the innate goodness of the world, there is room for improvement. There's room for maturity. There's room for increased harmony, unity, diversity, justice. We might just call that goodness. The world can be more good. The world can be better. So maybe it's not necessarily our work that burns us out, that we punch a time clock or we run our own business or whatever it is, but instead maybe the burnout is the overall state of things. And I think perhaps the paradox is that our work, which for many of us, for me, for example, the work is actually life-giving and vital, and it's this vocational, sacred contribution. But the paradox is that that still doesn't accomplish our deeper sense of ache for the world to be made right, that we wished were accomplished through our work. No matter how hard we work and how well we educate ourselves, how deeply we care, how much we engage, the world isn't ultimately fixed. Because harmony, that sort of harmony on a global scale, is messianic, which is to say it's always to come. It's always out in front of us. It's never really here and arrived in its fullness. So even if our work doesn't burn us out, we still end up burned out because we're left feeling like our work isn't getting the bigger work done. Like we can't make the difference that we want. We haven't got the impact or achieve the significance. How do we rest from that? How do we rest from that? Let me disappoint you, because you may be thinking, God, this is going to be an awesome sermon. I would love to know how to rest from that. I'm asking because I don't know. And we've got 6 weeks left in the series. So I'm going to try to figure that out in the next 6 weeks. But while that casserole is in the oven, we're going to riff on the paradox of work and rest themselves. Caitlin set this up really well last week. The tension, the paradox between genuine rest and legalistic practice. So we talked about Sabbath. We hinted at the tension between genuine experience of rest and legalism. Part of what we're saying is that this tension actually isn't something to be resolved, but it's actually in that tension, in the paradox, that rest happens. It's not either or, it's not one or the other, it's not binary. It's learning to rest in the midst of the tension between the two. Because without the legalism, we wouldn't create the container for rest, the habit. And without the genuine need for rest, we wouldn't care enough to create space for it. So there's this tension. We sort of need both. Sabbath creates tension between legalism and genuine rest because legalism is a commitment to practice, but practice creates space for genuine experience. They aren't the same, but we need both. They're held in tension. It's kind of like movements need institutions and institutions need movements. Legalism is the institution of practice, but it's meant to inspire. It's meant to create space. It's meant to build a container, to contain and empower and move us toward genuine rest. Similarly, we may have the most magnificent experience of genuine rest. And in and of itself, even though it's amazing, that experience alone is not sustainable. That one experience cannot carry you through your life. It needs the institution of regular practice. It needs a container for that experience in order to keep it vital, to keep it sustainable. Otherwise, it becomes another highlighted question mark. And so we sit here during a series like this and we go, man, do you remember that time I genuinely rested? It's like 4.5 years ago. How did that happen? How did that happen? What were the circumstances? I wonder if I could do that again. How did that, when could that happen? How could I make that? What would have to change? Right? The thing alone, the experience isn't enough. We need this container to make it sustainable and vital. Say something to us, Katie. Oh, you got a mic, don't you? Clarence, I can't turn this off, so just mute me.
Okay. So some of the ways that these tensions, paradoxes, show up in Sabbath and in our own rest practices arrive to us as loopholes. We require our own self-awareness and reflection to spot them. Again, not to resolve them, but to posture ourselves with more intention. So the question might be,
I got you, but you can do it.
oh, okay, cool. Are we fully getting into it, or are we trying to get around it? And even this is a paradox. We don't have to judge using a loophole, good or bad, but rather ask, how does it serve our call to rest? Where is it? Rabbi Halperman argues that all laws contain loopholes, God's included. God made no mistakes. He said, if he left a loophole, he put it there to be used. And even this is a paradox. Again, the question is, are we using it to fully sink into rest or to get around rest? It may be that in getting around the law, we're more able to genuinely rest, or that in skirting the law, we're avoiding rest, or that in strictly obeying the law, we're more liberated to rest. It's not binary, it's paradox. Okay, listen to this text one more time. Mark 2:23. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing this unlawful on the Sabbath?" He answered, "Have you ever read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar, the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate all the consecrated bread. and he also gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even on the Sabbath." Ta-da. Jesus giving the example of David is important because he's reminding his contemporary peers that there is a precedent in the tradition where the spirit of the law supersedes the letter of the law. Like Nate's take the other week on the hierarchy of needs. Meeting basic human needs leads to human flourishing that must be the point of the law, not inhibited by it. So, sometimes the law is the loophole of the Spirit, and sometimes the Spirit is the loophole of the law. In the story of the Good Samaritan, the priest and Levite used the law as the loophole for getting around the right, just, humane thing in service of their neighbor and humanity. In the passage, Jesus uses the Spirit, doing the right thing, feeding his neighbor, the humane, compassionate thing, as the loophole of the law. The point of this is that legalism can go too far if it prevents positive, vital, living in service of a rule. Whether helping a neighbor or eating when hungry, a law like the Sabbath is meant to serve people, not vice versa. The law is meant to be the means to an end, but the end is always human flourishing, justice, love of self and of neighbor. Or in this case, the end is rest. Even if the means is the law, the institution of Sabbath, the legalistic practice, when the law ceases to serve the rest, it gets subverted in service of the spirit of rest. So some actual loopholes for Sabbath. So Sabbath has some rules, including things like limiting the distance one can walk from their home, what can be carried from the private to the public sphere, and the use of walkers and canes, even work related to parenting. So in some areas, Jewish people have created Eruvs. So Eruvs are a super cool thing. So you use string and you tie it between poles. They use telephone poles, electric poles, anything like that. And what they do is they connect it between houses, sidewalks, parks. The strings serve as an extension of their homes, making public areas private. This allows them on the Sabbath to carry things outside of their home, use walkers or canes outside, and even carry small children. So there's also this thing called a Sabbath pen that I thought was super cool. So there's a rule where you're not allowed to write more than 2 permanent characters during the Sabbath. And what a Sabbath pen does is it's a felt tip pen that uses disappearing ink. Right? So what you can do is you can write whatever you want, and then in a few days, you can either photocopy it or rewrite it, translate it, whatever, and then it just disappears. So technically, you wrote nothing permanent. Yeah. So I had a professor that would tell us that meditation was important and something that you really had to work hard at. However, if we tried while we were super tired, it's useless. He told us, just give up. It's not going to work. But what he did is, if you're tired and you try to meditate, go take a nap, leave it, come back. Try it again, you'll do great. It'll be fine. But what you really need to do is listen to what your body needs.
Awesome. Thank you. You can clap now and later. So good, right? She's a natural. We were also talking about how the loopholes that I'll use, I'll sit and watch a movie, and I'll force myself to sit there for 2 hours and watch a movie because I'm quote-unquote resting, but I've got my computer on my lap the whole time. I'm answering emails, and I'm not getting out of work mode, but I'm sort of pretending. Last week, I was at surf camp every morning with June out in Port Orange, and we're on the beach from at least 9 to noon, but we'd get there early. Some days we'd stay late. And even though there was important stuff going on, major projects, I found more than I was comfortable with that I was standing on the beach on the phone, watching her surf and not out in the water with her. And it's like this like, you can't make a clearer example of like being in a place where I ought to be relaxing and spending time with my kid, and I'm on the phone. And I get this honest, though. This comes from my dad. I blame him. My dad cannot vacation. He's just awful at it. He fills vacations with projects. And so We had a couple of cabins up in the Blue Ridge Mountains years ago before the economy tanked, and we'd go on vacation, and inevitably, within the first half of the first day of vacation, my mom would go, "Where's your father?" He's gone. He's out working on it. We hear power tools. He's like fixing the deck. He's out doing something. They recently came up to visit because they hadn't seen the kids in a while. And of course, like an hour into them being there, my mom's like, "Where's your dad?" We couldn't find him. Like, he's not on the property. We call him. He doesn't pick up his phone. An hour later, he gets back from Lowe's, where he's been buying materials so he can fix the porch. And he spends the rest of the day fixing the porch. And then like leaves and he's like, "Oh, I miss the kids." I'm like, "Yeah, no shit. You like didn't spend any time with them." Last week, I was sitting with Jess and Amber, and they were talking about the fact that for them, the weekend has really become catch-up time, right? They do the 9 to 5 thing during the week, and that's their like career work, but then the weekend becomes really just a placeholder for the work that didn't get done around the house. And so even though we call it a weekend, and even though it's quote-unquote time off, it's not a job that we're necessarily getting paid for, but it's still work. And so some of the awareness and self-reflection is the practice of asking this question. Am I really settling into rest? Or am I calling it rest, but finding ways around it? And we're really creative. Like I'm saying, I'm the most creative of them all. I can be quote-unquote resting and really be working. And how do we rest in the tension rather than always trying to resolve it? So I want to offer one practice, and this is fascinating. I learned this probably a year and a half or two ago. This is used by Navy SEALs and free divers. I learned this actually right around the time Pete, who's a part of Collective, he shared about this Buddhist idea of resting between each breath. And I think it comes from sort of the Tibetan tradition, especially related to like mountains in the Himalayas, and these Sherpas who are doing immense work would talk about how they can rest between each breath. Even when they're working all day, that the place they find rest is in that really thin, narrow space between breaths. And so this is pretty simple. You actually control the pace. I, most of the time, like to pace box breathing based on my breath or my heart rate. And the deal is this. You just build a box using your breath, but you're resting in between each breath. So you breathe 4 seconds in, and then you take 4 seconds of rest, which is like a slack tide. You're not breathing in. You're not breathing out. You're just still. For me, it feels really cool if you sort of leave your mouth kind of open. I don't just want to see you all look like that. I'm dead serious. It actually feels pretty good. So you breathe in 4 seconds, you rest for 4 seconds, you breathe out for 4 seconds, you rest for 4 seconds, in again. So that's why it's called box breathing. So let's try this. So in, rest, out, rest, in, rest, out, rest. Keep trying it. By the way, we know this works because this is how free divers, like the people that are unassisted by any sort of scuba gear or anything who dive to insane depths, this is how they prepare for and recover from those insane dives. And this is also how Navy SEALs keep their heart rate and their breathing under control in firefights. Like, as intense as it gets for human beings. So maybe it'll work for you. I know you're probably skeptical, and I know you're very stressed. Give it a shot this week. Give it a shot. Box breathing. It's really simple. You can remember it. I will give you this warning. If you get good at it and you do it for a long time, don't do it while driving. I had one really scary experience, and I don't do it while driving anymore because I got in the zone, and then I woke up, and it was scary. So again, though, the tension between, or the tension of resting, somehow resting between each breath, that it's not about entirely ceasing work. It's not about being insanely workaholic. It's about how do you sort of hold the tension. And this tension, this paradox follows us even into the practice of hospitality.
Hello? Yeah, cool.
Yeah, you're on.
Hey. So the law of hospitality, the paradox of hospitality, and in particular the meal practice, is how both legalistic observation and breaking the law can create hospitality and space for rest and unconditional belonging. Hospitality is defined as a friendly and generous reception and entertainment of guests, visitors, or strangers. There's a tradition in the Torah to invite strangers or guests to one's Shabbat meal. It is said that the welcoming of a guest takes precedence over the welcoming of the divine presence, a way that the law allows for anyone to be welcome to the table in accordance with the kosher laws. By keeping kosher, it may create a divide and a need for two, kosher and non-kosher. However, keeping kosher also allows for more people to be welcomed to the table. So in a sense, keeping even a legalistic, exclusive law is a form of radical hospitality.
And then the flip side of that, breaking the law as a form of radical hospitality. Jesus, in the passage we keep reading, breaks the Sabbath so that the hungry can eat. And often he breaks the law, including sinners, the unclean, sex workers, the financially corrupt, the working poor, political predators, and other outcasts and salacious figures in his meal practice as a form of radical hospitality that extends beyond the exclusions of the law. And the point is, sometimes we can honor the law and we can make space by including those that would otherwise self-exclude because of their own legalism or because the law doesn't explicitly command it. But then other times, we can break the law and include those that would be excluded by the law itself. In both cases, the point we want you to hear is that the spirit of the law is to include, is to set the table. In the Seder meal, Jesus breaks from the tradition in such a way that the meal becomes even more inclusive. That was cool. I didn't know it made a sound when you dragged it. It's a flourish for you. He begins with a tradition that makes the meal inclusive and accessible to his friends, to his context. These are people who would have understood the Seder, they would have felt comfortable because it was within the law and within the tradition. But then he sort of blows this wide open, I think both in space and time. So he sets an open table. This is spatially open to all, from which no one is excluded. And then temporally, he offers sort of an all-encompassing experience of human life. He says, as often as you eat and drink. So you've got this sort of space-time. We might translate this invitation like this. Anyone with any need from anywhere, come. Anyone with any need from anywhere, come. The symbol that he chooses levels the playing field by connecting everyone to the great equalizer, our own mortality. Federico Garcia Lorca says, in each thing there is an insinuation of death. Stillness, silence, serenity are all apprenticeships. The table of this apprenticeship, this little restful practice of death, this spirituality of mortality, the symbolic expression of the sacred paradox that to find our lives we must lose them, practicing little deaths like rest, for example, the practice of rest in a frenetic, accomplishment-driven world. The table of this universal hospitality and this sacred paradox is set for us tonight. But it is open to us and to all people, and no one will ever be turned away. When you're ready, feel free to come and grab a piece of bread and dip it in the cup.